Good afternoon. My name is Maria Monteiro, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you here, those who are in the room and those who are joining us online. Our presenter today is Carol Scott, and she has served as an organist and choir director in several denominations since 1990. In 2000, she earned a master's degree in theological studies from Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminaries in Elkhart, Indiana. She is currently the organist and choir director at Hamilton Union Presbyterian Church in Guilderland, New York. Her presentation today is titled Indian Melodies by Thomas Commuck. Let's welcome Carol.
The Narragansett Indians have a tradition that this tune was heard in the air by them and other tribes bordering on the Atlantic coast many years before the arrival of the whites in America, and that on their first visiting a church in Plymouth Colony after the settlement of that place by the whites, the same tune was sung while performing divine service, and the Indians knew it as well as the whites. Those are the words of Thomas Commuck, published with the tune we've just heard in his Indian Melodies in 1845. Indian Melodies is believed to be the first published music by a Native American composer. Thomas Commuck was a Narragansett Indian, born in 1804 in Charlestown, Rhode Island. As a young man, he moved to New York State to a settlement known as Brothertown, and later relocated with the Brothertown community to Wisconsin, where he wrote the Indian Melodies. I think we're all familiar with a broad picture of encounters and relationships between indigenous peoples and European colonizers on this continent. Today, we're going to follow one thread from first contact to the present. Those words about music in the air paint a vision of beautiful possibilities. Many of the Narragansett accepted Christianity quite early and generally lived in peace with the European arrivals, but the path was far from smooth. It's amazing to me that Commuck included those words without apparent bitterness, knowing what had occurred between his people and European colonists. And in other writings, he also expressed a fatalistic view that Brothertown Indians would not endure long. 2 centuries later, they have endured, but through constant challenges. Some necessary details to begin. The word Indian began as a geographical mistake and has all too often been used in a derogatory way, and sometimes other terms have been preferred, like indigenous or native people. But many modern tribal members have reclaimed the name Indian, including the present-day people of the Brothertown Indian Nation, and Commuck also called himself an Indian, so I use the term respectfully. Commuck referred to European people he met as white, and I do too, but also as Euro-Americans or colonizers. Also, I'm not Native American. My interest in Commuck began after a surprising result from an internet search, which opened a window to Commuck, to Brothertown, and to a new and still developing understanding of American history. I'll be interrupting us occasionally to sing, and we will sing Old Indian Melody later, but we're going to start out with something else. And incidentally, if anyone has had trouble with tech, I brought some paper. So, oh. So we're going to begin with The Wind Speaks to Commuck's tune Algonquin. There are 7 tribes that founded Brothertown, which I'll talk more about later. 6 of them have tunes named after them. The last tribe, the Tunxus, had lost their original name at that point and were being called the Farmington. And we kind of wonder if he didn't not want to include an English name for them, so he put Algonquin in to embrace them because they are all Algonquin or Algonquian tribes. So that's where the tune name comes from. The text is from a present-day composer, John Dallas, and graciously gave permission to share this. And in the interest of saving time and voice, we will sing verses 1 and 4. Commuck's story begins with his birth tribe, the Narragansett Indians. They lived on the Atlantic coast in the area we now know as Rhode Island, so they were among the first American natives to come in, North American, to come into contact with Europeans. As early as 1524, Giovanni Verrazzano sailed along the coast from North Carolina to Nova Scotia, making contact with coastal tribes along the way. Within the next century, Europeans established settlements on the East Coast, including what we now call Massachusetts, and developed trade relationships with the surrounding tribes. When Roger Williams was expelled from the Massachusetts colonies, he took refuge among the Narragansett and settled among them in what we now know as Providence, Rhode Island. Again, it seems like a peaceful start, but as across the entire continent, many Indians died as the result of diseases for which they had no resistance, possibly as much as 90% of the native population. Native tribes quarreled over shares of trade with the Europeans, and the colonizers constantly wanted more land. We know that the land purchases and trade agreements were often not fair or beneficial to the Indians, and alcohol as a trade good had terrible effects. These stresses led to major conflicts. One of the earliest conflicts is known as King Philip's War from 1675 to 1678. During this war, a military force of Puritans from Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Connecticut massacred a group of Narragansett, mostly women, children, and elderly men at their winter camp. It's remembered by them as the Great Swamp Massacre. Some of the Narragansett who were captured were sold into slavery in the Caribbean islands. Commuck memorialized a number of Indians involved in this conflict in the names he gave to his hymn tunes, including King Philip, as we called him, as the white people called him, a Wampanoag leader known among his people as Metacom. As we pause to sing again, I'll talk about the adaptations, the music you have in front of you. I've kept the tunes and harmonies as they are in Indian melodies, but I have transposed most of them down. He wrote for a high note of an F or G most of the time. And I have switched the lyrics around because he only wrote the tunes, so I have chosen sometimes new lyrics and lyrics that I think sing very well today. And in the custom of the time, he was published in both shape notes and round notes, but customarily there's the bass line and then the melody line and then the alto and then the tenor. And I've put it in the 4 staff that we're used to with the words in the middle. So our next is another John Dallas text, Jesus Meet Us Where We Are, to Philip, named after Chief Medicom King Philip. And let's do 1 and 3, please. After King Philip's War, the remaining Narragansett mostly retreated to their lands near Providence and Charlestown. Decades later came the Great Awakening, the first wave of religious revivals across the European settlements. Native people, as well as European colonizers and enslaved people, heard the preaching of George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and other revival preachers, and many Indians became Christian. They also enthusiastically adopted the singing of psalms and hymns. Many of the Narragansett converted in 1743. They continued living in contact with the Euro-American settlers on reservations or living and working among them as servants or laborers. Trade agreements and land deals continued, and having Christianity in common didn't improve the deals they were given. There were more conflicts, large and small, including the Revolution, with some Indians assisting the settlers, some the British, and others simply caught in the middle. This brings us to the birth of Thomas Commuck in 1804, quite possibly a third-generation Christian. As a boy, Commuck attended a school sponsored by the Society for Propagating the Gospel Among Indians and Others in North America for a few years. This was a local school, not residential, and while European-style culture was certainly taught, the Indian students don't seem to have been overly forced to conform. The main concern mentioned in the early years of the school is that the students wear shoes, which were provided if necessary. Many of the Narragansett apparently spoke mostly English. Commuck mentions learning just a few phrases of Algonquin from his grandmother. We know very little else about his life until 1825, when Commuck, now in his 20s, made an enormous life change. He moved to the Oneida Territory in what is now upstate New York to a settlement called Brothertown. Our next hymn is Now the Shades of Night Are Gone. The tune name is Little Osage, commemorating either the river or a part of the Osage tribe in Kansas and Nebraska. Now the shades of night are gone, I'm a little ahead of myself. It is a text by Samson Occam, who is one of the founders of Brothertown, as we'll learn a little more in a bit. And let's do 1 and 2, please. idea behind Brothertown had begun decades even before Commuck's birth, before the Revolutionary War, when a number of Indians became concerned about the future of their tribes. They were worried about the pressures I've talked about, the land disputes, the prejudice against Indians, and especially the problems caused by alcohol. They still believed in the Christian gospel, but concluded that the only way Indians could survive was by having some separation from the colonizers. Members of several tribes in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Long Island began looking for land for a new Indian settlement. Some of the leaders were educated in schools run by the colonizers. Two, Samson Occam and Joseph Johnson, were ordained Presbyterian ministers. Coincidentally, Samson Occam is honored in the Episcopal Church with a feast day, and it is today on the anniversary of his death. In about 1774, this group negotiated with the Oneida tribe and the colonial government for a large plot of land near Utica in what's now New York State. Some Indians moved there and built a small village, but the Revolutionary War disrupted life in the area, and they retreated to Massachusetts to live with the Stockbridge tribe for several years. After the war, they returned, and in 1785, the town of Brothertown was formally organized with an elected clerk and trustees. Hundreds of members of 7 tribes, and I'm going to name them to give them honor, the Narragansett, Niantic, Mohegan, Eastern Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, Tunxus, and Montaukett, moved there and quickly began to consider themselves a new tribe, the Brothertown Indians. Some Narragansetts from Charlestown were part of the new settlement, and in the early 1820s, Thomas Commuck joined them. He had a share in the land there, and in 1831, he married Hannah Abner, a Pequot Indian. Unfortunately, as the white settlements moved west, the same problems emerged again: pressure to sell or lease their land, prejudice and disputes, easy access to alcohol. Even before Commuck arrived in New York, the people of Brothertown had decided they needed to move again. They found land in Wisconsin, negotiating this time with the Menominee and Winnebago tribes and the United States government. In 1831, Thomas and Hannah Commuck were part of the first group to move to Wisconsin. They took the Erie Canal to Buffalo and then traveled by boat on the Great Lakes and up the rivers to their new settlement. And in honor of that watery journey, we will sing Beside the Still Waters, tune name Osceola, after a leader of the Seminole Indians in Florida. I gave you a bonus setting of Osceola because I found 2 texts that I loved with it. So at the back of your packet, there's also a setting of an adaptation of the Lord's Prayer. But we will sing Beside the Still Waters, verses 1 and 3. So now Commuck and the Brothertown Indians were settling in Wisconsin, and the pattern continued. And within a few years, the US government decided that the people of Brothertown should move again, this time to Kansas. This time, the Brothertown Indians pushed back. In the end, they asked for and struck a new deal. They asked to become citizens and hold their land like any other citizen rather than as an Indian reservation. In a report dated 1839, a Mr. Bronson from the Committee on the Territories encouraged granting the request for citizenship. He said that the Brothertown Indians, quote, have devoted themselves to the cultivation of the soil and have become both civilized and Christianized to a higher degree than perhaps any other tribe of Indians on this continent. Commuck himself says that the Brothertown Indians were perfectly assimilated to their white brethren. Of course, they were not becoming civilized, they were already civilized. They were conforming to white ways of living in order to survive. Bronson mentions that they have churches and schools and that most of them can read and write English. A joint resolution of the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature also urged that citizenship should be granted. Mr. Bronson even says that it should be granted both as a reward for their becoming civilized and as an apology for the countless wrongs which these tribes have suffered at our hands. In 1839, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution granting citizenship to the Brothertown Indians. To conform to U.S. legal procedures, the land was divided up and assigned to each person, women as well as men, except for women who had married outside the community. Commuck became one of the 5 commissioners who helped to divide the land, and later postmaster, and even stood as a candidate for the Wisconsin Territories House of Representatives in 1844, but he lost. The first Methodist church built in Wisconsin was built on a portion of his land. He was paid $35 for 3 acres for the purpose. There are no pictures of him, but we have quite a few of his writings. Brief histories of Brothertown and Calumet County, some letters and poems, and of course the Indian Melodies and his introduction to them. We have a number of letters, one of which is just fascinating for me, and I have a copy if you want to find it me later. He addresses a legal matter to a lawyer back in Rhode Island, and he does it in 13 verses of rhymed long meter. Our next song is Peace, Troubled Soul, the tune named Kiskara. He says in his introduction that he's using the names of Indian tribes and people so that they will not be forgotten, which makes it all the more ironic that we don't know what Kiskara represents. They're gone. I used a set of words that he actually used in Indian Melodies, but I've changed the tune. So Peace, Troubled Souls is also in the book. Let's do 1 and 3 again. I think the high note towards the end of that is just exquisite. It's in Wisconsin that Commuck wrote his hymn tunes down, beginning in about 1838. He probably learned some music in his school in Rhode Island, and quite likely more in New York. Tune books of the time commonly contained an introduction to the basics of music. and it seems he mostly taught himself composition and notation from these and from experience singing in worship. Indian Melodies was published simultaneously in standard notation and patent notes, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, so you know that shape notes are an easy way of teaching vocal music, where the notes have different shapes to indicate what the pitch is in the scale. Some early versions of shape notes came to the US from Europe in the 1700s. The version used in Indian Melodies was introduced around 1800 in the areas around Philadelphia and Albany. The copies of Indian Melodies that we know were owned by Brothertown Indians are all of the shape note edition, so that's likely, presumably, what they used. But his hoped-for audience included churches where the round note edition would have been favored. We don't know who made the decision to publish in both forms, perhaps Commuck himself or perhaps the publisher in order to widen the potential audience. Shape note music and church music are often thought to have been very separate during Commuck's time, but the Methodist denomination seems to have been a connecting point. The main Methodist tune book, written to accompany their book of texts, was published first in standard notation in 1821, but in shape notes in 1833. And that may be what Commuck had. Our modern hymnals have the music and text all in one with the words interlined. At Commuck's time, words and tunes were published separately. You would have a book of texts and a book of tunes, and not everyone might even have the tune books. A hymnal or hymn book would contain words only. It was easy to print compactly and made it possible to read the texts as poetry, as devotional poetry. Tunes were published in separate tune books, often with just one or two verses of words. The combination of words and tunes weren't fixed. It was the job of the music leader to choose which tune to sing with a text. In fact, the tunes are organized not by any attribute of the words, but according to the meter, so that one can browse all the tunes that fit a particular text. In fact, Indian Melodies does not have an index of first lines. It only has a metrical index and an index to tune names. Both hymn books and tune books contain indications of the meter to help with process, but there's still some skill involved with choosing a tune that fits the feel of the words, and as many of you have probably heard, to have the emphasis falling on the correct syllable. Commuck used texts, from the 1821 Methodist Episcopal Hymn Book for inspiration, mostly texts by Charles Wesley and Isaac Watts. And again, often only one verse of the text, and in several cases he wrote more than one tune to the same words, a clear indication that he knew that the tunes would be mixed and matched with various texts as needed. There are a total of 120 melodies, of which 116 are original by Commuck. He describes two others as tunes known among the Indians, and there's one tune each by Thomas Hastings and Lowell Mason. In the introduction, Commuck mentioned that he wanted to include other tunes that his people knew, but was prevented by copyright. We're not the first people to wrestle with that. But everything I'm doing here today is copyright-free, or permission to use. Thomas Hastings personally knew Lowell Mason, and he edited the Indian Melodies, so he may possibly have requested permission for that one tune to round out the total number to 120. So now we are going to sing Pequot, the Lord Almighty Reigns, text from a 1909 metrical version of the Psalms, and Pequot after the Pequot tribe that I've mentioned several times now. Let's do 1 and 4, please. page says that the tunes were harmonized by Thomas Hastings, a prominent church musician and composer of the time. That raises the question of how much Commuck wrote and how much Hastings might have changed. Unfortunately, there really is no information about this, so we have to speculate. How did Hastings come to be involved? The connection seems to have been made only through the publisher. Hastings and Commuck both lived in Utica for a number of years, overlapping, but there is no evidence that they ever met. Commuck might have been aware of Hastings and his musical activities in the area, and might even have learned music from books published by Hastings. But in the journal Hastings kept while he worked on the Indian Melodies, the entries he wrote give no indication that he knew anything of Commuck. So how much did Commuck write? The title might indicate that he only wrote melodies, but the original tune, it was a working title was Indian songs, not tunes. So that might indicate that he wrote the harmony. And there are some features of the harmonizations that are different from Hastings' own work. There's a striking use of unison passages, which are unusual in our hymnody and more common in his. There are more minor key tunes than in most tune books, and if you're looking for something that sounds Indian, that's probably where it is. Both native people and shape note singers argue that Commuck probably would have written in the minor sounding modes rather than our harmonic minor scale, and that Hastings may have added those. I've stuck to what's on the page as I transcribed, but in a moment we'll sing one that's altered to reflect that idea. In any case, these features make me believe Commuck must have indicated the harmony somehow, perhaps writing in 3 parts, which Hastings expanded to 4. Because of the mixing and matching of tunes and text, hymn tunes are given their own names, and Commuck chose to use the names of Indian individuals, tribes, and places as these names to keep them alive. It's quite poignant to me that the first tune in the book is called Pequot. The Pequot tribe had especially suffered during the early years of colonization and was nearly wiped out. But Commuck's wife, Hannah Abner, was from that tribe. One researcher comments that maybe Thomas would have had no peace at home if he hadn't made Pequot first. The scope of the names is impressive. I'm not sure how many of us could name 116 or 120 different native tribes, places, and people. They reveal a deep knowledge of the history of his own tribe, other tribes of the Northeast, and beyond. They also have a subtle note of defiance. All of the individuals named in some way reflect resistance. Quite a few are leaders who died in conflicts with the colonizers, especially in King Philip's War. Others resisted in other ways. One is named Occam after one of the co-founders of Brothertown, and Commuck named a tune after his own family name. But we're going to sing Montauk with The Fruit of the Spirit by Marianne Diamond, another living composer who has shared this with us generously. The Montauk are one of the tribes that founded Brothertown, and I have altered this to remove all those pesky C sharps and put it in the mode that many people think he probably would have written in. And let's do 1 and 4, please. Why didn't Commuck's work become better known? He knew that his work might be scorned because it was the work of an Indian. In the introduction to the Melodies, Commuck says that he believes he is the first son of the forest to do anything in this line. He's well aware of the prejudice against Indians, referring to himself as, quote, having been born not only in obscurity, but being descended from that unfortunate and proscribed people, the Indians, with whose name a considerable portion of the enlightened American people. Is my mic dying? Sorry, I'm back. Let's begin at the beginning of that quotation from the introduction. He referred to himself as having been born not only in obscurity, but being descended from that unfortunate and proscribed people, the Indians, with whose name a considerable portion of the enlightened American people are unwilling to associate even the shadow of anything like talent, virtue, or genius, and as being wholly incapable of any improvement, either moral, mental, or physical. I don't believe he thought of himself that way. I think he knew he had to project extreme humility or he'd be accused of being arrogant. Maybe he also hoped that the novelty of his identity would pique some interest. He expressed hope that Christians, at least of his own Methodist Episcopal denomination, would give him some support and attention. In his own words, he feels willing to acknowledge openly and frankly the truth, and he assures his friends and the public that notwithstanding all other ends which may result from the publication of this work, his object is to make a little money whereby he may be enabled by wise and prudent management to provide for the comfortable subsistence of his household and be enabled from time to time to cast in his mite to aid in relieving the wants and distresses of the poor and needy, and to spread the knowledge of the Redeemer and his kingdom throughout the world. But there was also a matter of very unfortunate timing. He was hoping for support from the Methodist Episcopal denomination, but during 1844 and 1845, that denomination was in turmoil over the question of slavery and ultimately divided into northern and southern denominations. Similar conflicts and splits were happening in the other Protestant denominations, leaving little energy for looking at a small tune book from an unknown composer. Sadly, Commuck died in 1855 and so was unable to continue to promote his book or publish more, and his Indian melodies were mostly forgotten. We'll sing Wabash next, O God of Light. This is a text by Carolyn Winfrey Gillette, and if you have not heard of her, you should go look at her website, and she has given for permission for this to be used with this tune. Named Wabash for the tribe and river in Indiana. At one point when Brothertown was looking to move away from New York, they tried to buy land there in Indiana, and that fell through, and that's when they went to Wisconsin. This is just 2 verses, so we'll sing both of them. After Commuck's death, the story of Brothertown goes on. After being granted citizenship, the Brothertown Indians still acted as a self-governing tribe. Citizenship meant they weren't forced to move again, but also meant they were responsible for taxes as individuals, and this resulted in many people losing or selling their land. Some Brothertown Indians married into other tribes, some moved individually or in groups, but still Brothertown continued as a tribe and community. Being citizens also partly insulated them from the abuses of the reservation system and the residential schools. But because of intermarriage, they definitely were still affected, and they still fell under the strange attitude towards Indians that simultaneously romanticized them and considered them inferior. In 1924, all Indians, the first inhabitants of this land, were finally granted citizenship. For a time after that, native rights made some gains, but then government policies turned towards what's called termination, ending the official standing of many tribes, trying to assimilate them fully into white society and not consider them Indian anymore. In the mid-20th century, some of the Brothertown Indians applying for programs available to Native Americans discovered that Brothertown was not considered a tribe, despite the fact that the US government had gone right on doing business with their governing body a number of times after 1839. Members of the Brothertown Indian Nation spent decades working on a process to restore their standing, only to be told in the end that the process doesn't apply to Brothertown because they were made citizens by that earlier act of Congress in 1839 rather than in 1924. They continue to seek restoration as a tribe, but need an act of Congress to complete that process. Restoration would help them to get funding, among other things, to protect their history, including the Brothertown cemeteries in New York and Wisconsin. Still today, there are thousands of Brothertown Indians and probably tens of thousands of people descended in part from Brothertown, some in Wisconsin, others dispersed to other areas. This brings us to the present day end of our story thread. It's a story of missed opportunities, but I reread those hopeful words. This tune was heard in the air many years before the arrival of the whites in America, and that on their first visiting a church in Plymouth Colony, after the settlement of that place by the whites, the same tune was sung while performing divine services, and the Indians knew it as well as the whites. The music and those words feel like a hand still stretched out, one small way to connect. First, we can listen for that music in the air that tells us that we are all connected. We can also keep singing the music and using the tunes, partly just because it's good music. I'm not advocating cultural appropriation. I'm suggesting that we accept the gift that we missed generations ago and use it as a bridge to remember the people and events of our common past. We can remember Thomas Commuck and the Narragansett people and Brothertown. Commuck wanted the music to help us to remember all Native Americans even as he feared they were dying out. We can honor that by keeping the tune names he chose and honoring the memories as we have today. We could even adopt the old Indian hymn and sing it to honor our Native sisters and brothers, our common humanity, our shared history, and our future together. And I'd like to sing one verse of the old Indian hymn now. I should say that I kept the words that he used in the original Indian melodies for that. And so now I have a little while to take questions, and after that I hope we can close by singing the last hymn that I put in. Lord, dismiss us. So are there questions? Yes?
Do you know where in present-day Wisconsin this town is located?
Excuse me. We want to use
Oh, they're going to bring the microphone over. And I should be, well, she asked where in Wisconsin they're presently located, and I should be able to say, and I can't off the top of my head. They are on one of the lakes just inland from the Great Lake along there.
They're in Fond du Lac.
Oh. Thank you so much. It was just not coming. Fond du Lac.
Oh, I know it.
On Lake Winnebago.
Lake Winnebago, yes.
Right.
And I will mention that there is a facsimile edition on Amazon, very inexpensively, of the original Shape Note edition. And if you go, you should have a page in your materials that has a link to IMSLP, which has my adaptation of all 120 of them into round notes in modern format so that you don't have to do the work of reading it in Shape Notes if you haven't done that before. It was an adventure. And if you want to know more about Brothertown, they have their own very fine website. Any more questions? Let's sing one more time then, please. Lord, dismiss us
I
with
have
our
one
blessing,
question.
and I will call this an arrangement simply because this is taken out of a long anthem. There are 3 anthems in Indian melodies, and they're kind of through composed things that are, each section is in a hymn-like format, and they just change from one to the next. And I took this piece out and then repeated the last phrase, which was something Commuck also loved to do anyway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being here. So what's happening next, just so you know, we have a break until 3:30. Then we have the connection zone. And you look at your sticker, you may be an automobile, corny dog, Michigan map, Motown, Red Wings.
And if the Zoom is up, I'm just going to say hello to anyone from Brothertown Indian Nation who tuned into us. They were given a gift link for today.
There is a question from Zoom.
I'd love to take it.
They say, how much is this part of the history? How much is this part of the history of the music originating in the States? I just read it as it was typed, and that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
It fits, it's very much of its time. He taught himself out of those tune books, and so most of it, as you noticed, sounds fairly conventional. But unfortunately, it was lost, and so the tunes themselves didn't enter in, but they fit right in. You can tell that he was very much a Methodist of his time. And my church is using some of the tunes now. I think some of them are very singable. Some of the others that are not singable would be magnificent as organ music or choir music. He occasionally wrote things that have an octave and a fifth range, which makes them rather unsingable as congregational music. So I don't know if any of that answers that question. Well, I guess we have a little free time before our next thing.